It was supposed to be the happiest night of their lives. For Officer Robert Rob Mitchell and his fiancée, Jenna Hayes, their wedding night was meant to be a celebration of love, the start of forever. After months of planning, all the small details had fallen into place. The elegant chapel, the flowers, the cake, and most importantly, the love between them. The couple had been through a lot in their relationship, and now at last they could begin their life together. But fate had other plans. The ceremony had been beautiful. Rob, a correctional officer at the Texas State Prison, stood in front of the altar in a black tuxedo, a nervous yet happy smile on his face. Jenna, radiant in her wedding gown, had looked like a vision, her blonde hair cascading down her back, her blue eyes sparkling with joy. Their vows were simple yet heartfelt. Rob swore to always protect her, and Jenna promised to be his partner, in good times and bad. They shared a kiss, and the guests erupted into applause. Later that evening, they celebrated with their closest family and friends at a lavish reception. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of romantic tunes filled the air. But as midnight approached, Rob and Jenna decided it was time to leave. They had rented a small cabin in the woods for a private honeymoon, far away from the noise of the city. They were excited, looking forward to spending the first night of their married life together, away from the pressures of their demanding jobs. What neither of them knew was that danger was already on the horizon. Around 1 a.m., Rob's cell phone rang, interrupting the blissful quiet of the cabin. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number from an unlisted Texas area code. He frowned. It wasn't unusual for Rob to get calls late at night. His work as a correctional officer sometimes demanded late-night updates or emergency notifications. He quickly answered, thinking it might be about a situation at the prison. "Hello?" A deep, feminine voice came through the phone, distorted by static. "Is this Officer Robert Mitchell?" the voice asked. "Yeah, who is this?" Rob's heart skipped a beat. There was something unsettling about the way the woman spoke. "It's me. Maria," she said, her tone cold and flat. Rob's stomach sank. Maria was his ex-girlfriend, and she had been the mother of his child, a son, Timothy, whom he hadn't seen in years. Their relationship had ended badly, with accusations and bitter arguments. She was known to be unpredictable and, frankly, a bit dangerous. Maria had been in and out of prison herself for various offenses, and it wasn't unusual for her to make veiled threats against Rob from time to time, especially when she was angry about child support or visitation arrangements. "Maria, what do you want?" Rob asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just checking in," she said with a sinister edge. "You know, it's a shame you're getting married tonight. I thought we could have had something real once. Too bad you threw that away." Rob's pulse quickened. He glanced over at Jenna, who was now sitting up in bed, looking at him with confusion and concern. Rob held up a hand to reassure her, but his mind was already racing. Maria had always been unpredictable, and he knew she wouldn't hesitate to cause trouble if she thought she had anything to gain from it. "I'm not interested, Maria. Please don't call me again," Rob said, his voice firm. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Maria spoke again. "We'll see about that." The line went dead, leaving Rob staring at his phone in disbelief. His mind raced. What did she mean by that? Was she threatening him? Was she going to do something to ruin their wedding night? Rob shook his head and let out a frustrated sigh. He turned to Jenna, who was now standing beside the bed, wearing a concerned expression. "Who was that?" she asked. "Maria," Rob muttered, his thoughts still spinning. "My ex." Jenna frowned. "What did she want?" "I don't know," Rob said, his eyes narrowing. "She was just being weird, threatening me." Jenna looked worried. "Are you sure it's over with her? I mean, she's been in and out of prison, right?" Rob nodded. "Yeah, she's got issues, but she's not my problem anymore. I'm with you now, Jenna, and I plan on keeping it that way." Jenna hugged him, trying to comfort him, but Rob couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Maria had always been volatile, but her tone tonight had been different. There was a coldness in her voice that unnerved him. Minutes passed in silence before Rob finally decided he had to try and forget about the conversation. He needed to focus on the night ahead. to make sure Jenna didn't feel like the shadow of his past was intruding on their happiness. He kissed her on the forehead. Let's get some sleep. We've got plenty of time to worry about everything tomorrow. But just as they settled back into bed, a strange sound broke the silence. Something outside. Rob's heart jumped. His instincts, honed from years of working as a correctional officer, told him something was wrong. He quickly got out of bed and moved toward the window, his hand reaching for the gun he kept in the nightstand. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. Footsteps, approaching slowly and deliberately. Jenna, stay here. Lock the door behind me, he whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. Jenna's face went pale and she grabbed his arm. Rob, what's happening? I don't know, but stay in here. Lock the door. Rob moved cautiously toward the front door, listening carefully. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what could be happening. Was this Maria's doing? Had she sent someone to confront him? To hurt them? He opened the door just a crack and peered into the night. Nothing. The air was still, the silence almost deafening. But then he heard it, a faint rustling from behind the cabin. Without thinking, Rob stepped outside, determined to confront whoever was out there. It was the last decision he would ever make. Within moments, the world erupted into chaos. Several shadows emerged from the trees, and Rob was surrounded. He barely had time to react before the first blow landed, a sharp, blunt object hitting the back of his head. He crumpled to the ground, vision fading to black. From inside, Jenna heard the commotion, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone to call 911 but hesitated. She didn't want to panic. She needed to check on Rob. With shaking hands, she ran to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. She found him lying on the ground, blood pooling around his head. A scream caught in her throat as she rushed to his side, her mind racing with fear and confusion. But before she could reach him, a figure stepped out from the darkness, a tall, shadowy figure that raised a knife in the air. Jenna froze, terror gripping her heart. The last thing she saw was the flash of steel coming down toward her. It wasn't supposed to end like this. It wasn't supposed to end at all. The next morning, the authorities found their bodies, lying in the dirt near the cabin. No one knew who had done it or why, but Detective Laura Evans was about to start her investigation into what would become a tangled web of deceit, revenge, and murder. And she would uncover secrets that no one could have anticipated. The air outside the Texas cabin was crisp and cool when Detective Laura Evans arrived at the crime scene. The early morning sun hung low on the horizon, casting a dim light across the woods. A handful of uniformed officers were already present, securing the area and taking preliminary statements. A few forensic specialists were crouched near the bodies, carefully collecting evidence, their movements precise and methodical. Detective Evans stepped out of her car, adjusting her badge and smoothing down the black jacket of her uniform. She was a seasoned investigator, having spent over 15 years with the Texas Rangers, and she'd seen her fair share of violent crime scenes. But there was something about this case that unsettled her, a feeling in the pit of her stomach that something far darker was lurking beneath the surface. She approached the lead officer, Officer Mark Reed, who was standing near the edge of the crime scene, watching the forensics team work. "Detective Evans," Reed greeted her, giving a small nod. "We've got 2 confirmed victims, both with severe head trauma. It looks like a violent ambush, but we're not sure of the exact details yet." "Who are they?" Evans asked, her voice steady despite the unease growing inside her. "We've identified them as Robert Mitchell, a correctional officer at the Texas State Prison, and his fiancée, Jenna Hayes." "They were married last night." Evans raised an eyebrow. "A wedding night gone wrong? That's a new one." Reed gave a grim smile, but his expression quickly turned serious. "Yeah, it's pretty bizarre. They were supposed to have been alone, in that cabin, far from anyone. There's no sign of forced entry or a struggle inside the cabin, but both victims were found outside. Whoever did this knew exactly where to find them." Evans knelt down, her eyes scanning the ground where Rob Mitchell's body was sprawled out. There was blood, a lot of it. A pool of crimson surrounded his head, his eyes wide open in a haunting, vacant stare. A few feet away, Jenna Hayes' body lay face down, her wedding dress soiled by the dirt and blood. Her neck had been slashed, the deep gash still fresh. The crime scene was messy, chaotic, and yet There was something deliberate about it. "So no signs of forced entry inside the cabin?" Evans asked, looking up at Reed. "None. The door was unlocked, but the interior's untouched. The wedding gifts are still there. The bed's made. Everything looks normal, except for the blood outside. Any witnesses?" "Not yet. Neighbors said they didn't hear anything unusual last night. The area's pretty isolated. Just a few cabins scattered around." Evans took a deep breath. "All right, we'll need to go over the victims' backgrounds thoroughly. Find out who would want them dead and why. And we'll also need to figure out how they got from the cabin to this spot." "Were they dragged?" Reed nodded. "Understood, Detective." "Good," Evans said, standing up. "Let's get started." The ride back to the station was quiet, the Texas landscape passing by in a blur of dull browns and greens. Evans had always found something oddly peaceful about driving through the Texas countryside, but today her mind was too focused to enjoy the view. At the station, she was greeted with a thick folder containing all the preliminary information about the victims. Officer Mitchell, she learned, was 32 years old, with a solid career in law enforcement. He had been working as a correctional officer for 6 years and had a history of clean conduct, with no significant incidents on record. His fiancée, Jenna Hayes, was 28, a nurse who worked at a local hospital. Both were described as good people, hard-working, upstanding members of their community. The more Evans read, the more she felt the weight of the tragedy. From all accounts, this was a couple who had finally found happiness after overcoming personal hardships. Mitchell, despite his troubled past with his ex-girlfriend Maria, had finally seemed to put his life together. He had recently reconciled with his ex-girlfriend and had been spending more time with his son, Timothy. But something didn't add up. Evans pulled out another set of documents, her eyes landing on the name that had already caught her attention: Maria Perez. According to the records, Maria was Mitchell's ex-girlfriend, a woman with a long criminal history that included charges for theft, drug possession, and assault. She had been in and out of prison multiple times. The most recent infraction had been for a domestic assault charge filed against her by a former partner, but it was her history with Mitchell that Evans found the most troubling. The two had a son together, Timothy, but Maria had fought bitterly for full custody of the child in the past. Evans quickly read through the statements from the custody hearings, which described Maria as volatile, unpredictable, and prone to violence. She had never fully agreed to Mitchell's new relationship with Jenna, and it seemed as though she'd harbored resentment toward Mitchell's attempt to move on with his life. That's when Evans realized something crucial. The phone call that Mitchell had received late at night, the one he'd brushed off as just another outburst from his ex, might have been more than just a random threat. It was a warning. "Reed," Evans called over her shoulder as she looked up from the folder, "I need you to find out where Maria Perez was last night. I think she might have had something to do with this." Reed frowned. "You think she's involved?" "I do," Evans said, closing the folder with a snap. "Maria was upset when Mitchell moved on with Jenna. He'd just gotten remarried, and she was known to lash out when she didn't get what she wanted. This could be revenge." Reed nodded and quickly got to work, pulling up information on Maria Perez. As Evans sat back, her thoughts swirled. Revenge was often a motive in cases like this, but there was something deeper at play. This didn't feel like a simple act of anger. The violence, both victims left outside, no forced entry, it all pointed to someone who had planned this carefully. As the hours passed, Evans began to put together a theory, but she wasn't ready to jump to conclusions just yet. She needed more information, more details, and that would come from digging deeper into the lives of Robert Mitchell, Jenna Hayes, and Maria Perez. By the end of the day, the investigation had barely scratched the surface, but Evans had a nagging feeling in the back of her mind that something far darker than a simple murder was unfolding, and whoever was behind it would stop at nothing to make sure the truth stayed buried. She could feel the tension tightening, like a noose around her neck. The more she uncovered, the less she knew who could be trusted. But one thing was for sure: someone was going to pay for what happened to Rob and Jenna, and Evans was determined to make sure of it. The next morning, Evans stood in front of her whiteboard, covered with the names of all the key people involved in the case: Robert Mitchell, Jenna Hayes, Maria Perez, and Timothy, the son. She started mapping out their connections, drawing arrows to show their relationships. Suddenly, she froze. her finger hovering over a name. She had just realized something. It wasn't just Maria who had the motive to kill Rob and Jenna. There was someone else. Someone who had been waiting in the shadows for years. It was time to dig deeper. Detective Laura Evans sat in her office, staring at the whiteboard with a growing sense of unease. The names of the key players in the case had now multiplied, each one leading to a series of connections, some innocent, others murky and dark. The more she analyzed, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was something far more calculated, with deep roots in betrayal, jealousy, and long-buried resentment. Maria Perez was a major piece of the puzzle, but as Evans stared at her list of suspects, another name kept resurfacing. Timothy Mitchell. Timothy was Rob's son, though Rob had only recently started to have regular contact with him after years of estrangement. Maria had been fiercely protective of Timothy, and Evans knew all too well how easily a bitter ex could manipulate a child. But what struck her as odd was the timing of everything. Maria had never been particularly keen on allowing Rob to build a relationship with his son, yet Rob had started to re-establish that bond recently. What if Timothy had been caught in the middle of something far worse than a mere custody battle? Evans picked up the phone and dialed Officer Reed's number. "Reed, I need you to dig deeper into Timothy's background," she said when he answered. "Check for any signs of unusual behavior and see if there's any indication he's been influenced or coerced in any way. I want to know everything." "You think Timothy's involved?" Reed asked, his voice cautious. "I don't know yet," Evans replied, rubbing her temples. "But something about the timing of all this feels off. Rob had just started getting closer to Timothy, and Maria's never been a woman to let go of anything. I need more details on her relationship with her son, especially over the past few months." "Got it. I'll pull his records and see what I can find." "Thanks, Reed. I'll be here, going over the rest." After ending the call, Evans leaned back in her chair and turned her attention back to the investigation. She knew Maria had been difficult to deal with, but this case was beginning to take on a strange pattern. There were connections that hadn't fully revealed themselves yet, and it was only a matter of time before she found the threads that would lead her to the truth. A few hours later, Reed returned with the information Evans had requested on Timothy Mitchell. "Detective," Reed began as he walked into her office, holding a folder in his hands. "I've got a few things that might interest you." Evans motioned for him to sit. "Lay it on me." Reed opened the folder and started pulling out several documents. Timothy Mitchell, age 10, he's been living with his mother, Maria Perez, for most of his life. There are a few things here that stand out, though. For one, Timothy has been in and out of counseling for anger management issues since he was 6 years old. Apparently, Maria had difficulty controlling his behavior, and there were a few instances where he acted out violently at school. Evans frowned. Anything to suggest a violent history toward his father? Not directly, but there was one disturbing incident. According to a statement from his teacher, Timothy once spoke about hating his father during a classroom discussion. He told his classmates that Rob didn't care about him and that Rob was too busy with his new girlfriend to spend time with him. His mother, Maria, apparently didn't correct him, and the teacher reported it to Child Services, but there were no follow-up actions. Timothy's behavior has been erratic, and there's a note here about an incident last year when he punched another kid in the stomach. When asked why, Timothy said he didn't like people who take things away from him. Evans leaned forward, absorbing the information. So Timothy's been troubled for years, and Maria's not exactly helping him work through those feelings. That could explain some of the anger. But what about his relationship with Jenna? Reed shook his head. Nothing on record about him and Jenna. In fact, no one seems to have really connected him to her at all, even though Rob and Jenna were together for a while before they got married. Evans nodded thoughtfully. This was something she'd need to explore further. The lack of records suggesting any significant relationship between Timothy and Jenna raised questions. Had Timothy resented Jenna for taking his father's attention away from him? Had Maria used her son to manipulate the situation? She flipped through the papers Reed had handed her, looking for anything else that stood out. What about Maria? Any signs that she might have involved Timothy in this? Did she influence him in any way? Reed hesitated before answering. It's hard to say. Maria's always been a loose cannon. But I found something strange. A month before Rob's wedding, Maria had been seen meeting with someone in a local park. A man who, according to some reports, was seen talking to Timothy on a few occasions. We don't have much information about this guy, but he might be someone who has influenced Timothy. Evans looked up sharply. A man? Who is he? I don't know yet, Reed replied, but I'm pulling more on that lead. Evans rubbed her eyes. The case was taking on more layers than she had anticipated. It was clear now that Timothy's relationship with his father had been strained for years, and his connection to Maria was undeniable. But the possibility of a third party, someone else influencing Timothy, was a disturbing thought. Whoever this man was, they needed to find him before the puzzle could be fully pieced together. That afternoon, Evans met with the medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Kim, at the morgue to go over the autopsy reports of Rob and Jenna. Dr. Kim was a no-nonsense professional, and Evans trusted her to provide the hard facts. Detective, Dr. Kim began, flipping through a file. The autopsies are complete. Both victims died from blunt force trauma to the head. Rob Mitchell was hit from behind, likely with a heavy object, maybe a metal pipe or something similar. Jenna Hayes' cause of death was a single stab wound to the neck. The wound was deep and swift, suggesting the killer had experience, or at least knew where to strike. Evans leaned forward, studying the report. Could it have been a crime of opportunity, or do you think it was planned? Based on the evidence, I'd say it was planned, Dr. Kim said firmly. Both victims were attacked outside in a secluded area where there was little chance of being interrupted. And the way they were killed, one with blunt force, one with a knife, suggests a certain level of control. It's not the act of an impulsive killer. Evans nodded. Any signs of defensive wounds? No, Dr. Kim replied. Neither victim put up much of a struggle. That's what makes it so strange. The victim's positioning, especially Rob's, suggests that he was ambushed. He didn't have time to react, which means the killer was very familiar with his surroundings. Jenna's wounds show that she was likely attacked immediately after, without any warning. So, this was personal, Evans murmured. Whoever did this wanted them both dead and made sure it was clean, efficient. But why bring them both out into the open like that? Dr. Kim's eyes narrowed. Maybe they wanted to make a statement. Maybe it's not just about the killings. Maybe it's about sending a message. Evans stood up, feeling the weight of the case pressing on her. I need to figure out who's sending that message. Whoever it is, they've left a trail. I'm going to find it. As Evans walked out of the morgue and back to her car, her thoughts raced. There were too many angles to consider, too many suspects who could have been involved. She needed more time, but there was one thing she knew for sure. The killer was close, too close, and the longer it took to unravel this web of lies, the more people were at risk. The investigation was far from over, but Evans was determined to get to the bottom of it. She would follow the clues wherever they led, no matter how dark the path became. There was one truth she could count on. Sooner or later, the killer would make a mistake, and that mistake would be their undoing. The days seemed to drag on as Detective Laura Evans continued to sift through the evidence. Each clue led her deeper into a maze of deception and half-truths, but nothing solid enough to tie the murderer to Rob and Jenna's deaths. The investigation had gone in several different directions, but one thing was becoming clearer. Whoever was behind these murders was skilled, patient, calculating, and careful in their movements. Evans leaned over the file again, scanning the notes about Timothy Mitchell. The more she thought about the boy, the more her gut told her he wasn't just a witness. He could be part of the scheme, and yet there was still no concrete evidence linking him directly to the crime. If he was involved, he hadn't made any obvious mistakes. But if Timothy was not the killer, then who was? There had to be someone else behind this, a person who was manipulating events from the shadows. Evans couldn't shake the thought of the mysterious man who had been seen in the park with Timothy, the man who had spoken to him, possibly influencing him in ways no one could understand. It was a lead that had come up in the last conversation with Reed, but at the time it hadn't seemed significant, but now it seemed like the missing piece she needed. The next morning she called Reed into her office. I need you to find out everything you can about this man. Whoever he is, whatever he's done, he's important. Reed sat down across from her and opened a new folder. I've been working on that. The guy's name is Carlos Vargas. He's a known associate of Maria Perez. He's been in and out of jail for various offenses, mostly drug-related, but there are a few assault charges as well. His last known address was a rundown apartment complex near the edge of town. We've got a few reports that say he's been seen hanging around Maria's house, but no one's ever pressed charges. Evans leaned forward. Has anyone actually talked to him recently, or is he just a ghost? Reed shook his head. That's the thing. No one can seem to get a straight answer. He's been elusive, and no one's seen him around for a while, but there's a few things I'm piecing together. He was spotted leaving a convenience store 2 days before the murder. A witness said he looked anxious, like he was waiting for something, or someone. Evans's mind raced. And that witness, what else did they see? Did they notice anything about his interactions with Maria, or anyone else? Reed flipped through his notes. The witness didn't see much, just that Vargas had been in the store, acting jittery. But then he left in a hurry, and no one's been able to track him down since. Evans sat back in her chair, running her fingers over her lips. Jittery, that's interesting. It sounds like he was expecting something, or someone. And if he was with Maria, there's a chance that he's the one who convinced Timothy to help carry out the murders. Reed nodded. That's what I'm thinking, but I can't prove it yet. I need to get more on Vargas. See if anyone's been in contact with him recently. Do it, Evans said, her voice sharp. I want everything on Vargas, and start checking if anyone else has seen him with Timothy in the last month. As Reed left to follow up on his lead, Evans took a moment to let the weight of the case settle over her. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling town beyond the glass. This was the kind of case that made her question everything. What she knew about human nature, what she knew about people who wore masks of normalcy. There was a darkness here, a silent kind of evil, and she was starting to realize how deep it ran. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed. It was Reed again. She picked it up quickly. Evans, I've got something. We've located Carlos Vargas. He was picked up on a traffic stop this morning. His car was registered to a woman named Angela. But the weird part is, he didn't have any identification on him. Not even a fake ID. We're bringing him in for questioning. Evans felt her pulse quicken. Good work. Keep him under wraps until I get there. I'm on my way. An hour later, Evans walked into the small, dimly lit interrogation room where Carlos Vargas was sitting. He was a tall man, with rough stubble on his face and eyes that darted nervously as he watched her enter. His hands were shackled to the metal table, but there was a defiance in his posture that made Evans uneasy. He was used to being in situations like this. Vargas didn't look up as she sat down across from him, his gaze fixed on the floor. Carlos Vargas, Evans said, her voice calm but authoritative. You've got a lot of explaining to do. Vargas remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. Evans leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her. You've been seen with Timothy Mitchell, and I know you've been in contact with Maria Perez. You know what happened to Robert Mitchell and Jenna Hayes, don't you? At her words, Vargas's eyes flicked up to meet hers for a brief moment before he looked away again. His breathing had become shallow, and there was a visible twitch in his hand, as if he was trying to fight the urge to fidget. He wasn't as calm as he wanted to appear. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, his voice rough. I've never been involved in anything like that. Evans didn't buy it. You've got a history of assault, drug charges, and a whole lot of other things. Don't try to play innocent with me. You've been seen with Maria and her son. We know you're lying. Vargas's eyes shifted uneasily again, and his lip trembled for a moment before he spoke. Look, I don't know what Maria told you, but I wasn't part of whatever happened to those people. I don't know anything about it. Evans narrowed her eyes, keeping her voice steady. Maria's not going to help you, Carlos. She's not the one who's been arrested, and she's not the one in this room, sweating bullets. You're in this deep, and the more you lie, the worse it's going to get for you. Tell me the truth. For a moment, Vargas didn't say anything. The tension in the room grew thick. Then slowly, as if the weight of his guilt finally broke him, he spoke. Okay, he said in a low voice. Maria. She didn't want him to go through with it. She didn't want her son involved. But the kid, Timothy, he hated them, hated his dad. And Maria, she knew how to get him to do what she wanted. She told him that Rob had abandoned him for good, that he was never going to get the attention he wanted as long as Jenna was in the picture. She twisted it in his head. And when she asked me to help, I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know how far it would go. But Maria wanted them dead. She told me to make sure they paid for everything. Every time Rob had rejected her and the kid. Evan's heart sank. So you're saying Maria didn't kill them, but she used Timothy to do it? Vargas nodded slowly, his face pale. She made him believe it was his only way of getting his dad's attention. And she used me to make sure it happened. I didn't think it would end like this. But she promised me money, promised me that I'd get out of this life if I helped. But I was too stupid to see it for what it was. Evans leaned back, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She had thought Maria Perez was dangerous, but this was something even worse. Maria had played everyone, using her son as a pawn in her sick game of revenge. And now it seemed like the entire town was on the edge of a terrifying truth that no one could ignore. She stood up, the anger bubbling inside her, but she knew this was just the beginning. There was still more to uncover, more to bring to light. But one thing was clear. Maria Perez was at the center of it all, and it was time to end this nightmare once and for all. I'm not done with you, Vargas, Evans said coldly, but for now you're going to help me find Maria Perez, and you're going to tell me everything you know about what happened that night. Vargas didn't argue. He knew he was in too deep, and with that, the final piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. The room was cold, and the fluorescent lights above flickered with a faint hum. Detective Laura Evans sat across from Carlos Vargas, who had just confessed to his role in the events leading up to the murder of Rob and Jenna. But his confession had left Evans with even more questions. Maria Perez had orchestrated the entire thing. She had twisted her son Timothy's mind, turning him against his father and using him as a tool of destruction. But what had driven Maria to this point? Evans rubbed her forehead, trying to wrap her mind around the layers of manipulation that had been exposed. Vargas, meanwhile, sat slumped in his chair, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds, as if hoping for an escape that wasn't coming. He'd already given up most of the details, but Evans needed more. More about Maria's past, more about what exactly happened on the night of the murder, and more about Timothy's involvement. Vargas, you've given me a lot, but I need everything you know, Evans said, leaning forward. Maria didn't just wake up one day and decide to murder her ex-husband and his fiancé. What happened between her and Rob? And why did she involve you in all of this? Vargas swallowed hard, his throat dry. He shifted in his seat, his eyes glazed with a mix of fear and guilt. Maria's been through a lot, okay? She's got her demons. She couldn't get over Rob. They were together for a long time, and he left her and Timothy. Evans listened intently as Vargas continued. Maria's pride was hurt when Rob left. He got with Jenna so quickly, and it made her furious. It wasn't just about her. She didn't care about him moving on. But when he started ignoring Timothy, that's when things really got bad. Maria always said Rob was a good father, that he cared about his son. But when he stopped showing up for Timothy's games, his school events, when he stopped being there for him, she blamed it all on Jenna. Evans nodded, understanding the bitterness that had been festering in Maria. But that doesn't explain why she would kill them. It's one thing to be angry, but this goes beyond anger. You're telling me Maria wanted them dead. Vargas shifted again, his eyes finally meeting Evans. She wanted them gone, yes, but it wasn't just her. She made it sound like it was all about Timothy, but it wasn't. She was just as angry at Rob for leaving her behind. She said he owed her. She felt like she'd been the one who supported him when things were tough, and he just walked away. When Jenna came along, Maria said it was like Rob had forgotten everything they'd been through. She was consumed with hatred. Evans's mind raced as she processed Vargas's words. Maria's motive seemed to be rooted not only in her hatred for Jenna, but in a deeper sense of entitlement. It wasn't just about love for her son. It was a warped sense of betrayal. And you? Why did you help her? Evans asked, her voice calm but firm. Why get involved in this? Vargas hesitated, running his hands through his hair. I, I've done things for Maria before. She knew people, and she promised me money. I've been running from my own demons. I was desperate, you know? Maria offered me a way out, told me she could help me get out of the life I was in. She said if I helped her, everything would change. She didn't force me, not really, but she made it sound like it was the only way out. Evans studied Vargas carefully. His story sounded rehearsed, like he was trying to justify his own actions. He had been a willing participant, at least to some extent. So you helped her get Timothy involved? Evans pressed. Vargas nodded. I didn't want to at first, but Maria kept pushing. She told me that if Timothy didn't do it, someone else would. She made it sound like it was the only way to fix things, to make Rob pay. She said if Timothy was part of it, he'd be able to reclaim his dad's attention. Maria kept pushing. And, well, Timothy, he wanted Rob's approval so badly. He was just a kid. Maria used that. She played on his insecurities. Evans felt her stomach twist. Maria had manipulated her son, twisted a child's love and need for attention into a weapon. But there was something more troubling. How much had Timothy actually known about what was happening? Had he been fully aware of the consequences, or had he been coerced into thinking this was just another way to get his father's love? Before Evans could speak, Reed walked into the room, his face grim. He had a piece of news that she'd been expecting, but hoping wouldn't come. Detective, we've got a hit on Timothy Mitchell, Reed said, his voice heavy. He's been spotted at Maria's apartment. Evans stood up quickly, her heart racing. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. Vargas, stay put. Don't even think about moving. She rushed out of the room with Reed trailing behind her. The sense of urgency in the air was palpable as they headed toward the location where Timothy had been seen. Maria Perez had been elusive, and now it seemed she was cornered. But what would happen when Evans and her team arrived? Would Maria surrender, or would she fight to the bitter end? 20 minutes later, Evans pulled up to the dilapidated apartment building on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that had seen better days, a concrete structure that looked as if it was barely holding itself together. Police cars and unmarked vehicles lined the parking lot. Officers milled around, preparing for what might be a volatile confrontation. Evans stepped out of the car, her mind sharp, focused. Reed was already briefing a group of officers about the situation. Timothy Mitchell had been seen entering his mother's apartment about 20 minutes ago. The door had been slammed shut, and no one had come in or out since. The tension in the air was thick as Evans approached Reed. "What's the status?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "We've got eyes on the apartment, but we haven't seen anyone move in or out since Timothy went in," Reed reported. "We're about to make entry. We need you to give the go-ahead." Evans took a deep breath. She knew what she was about to do could change everything. If they were lucky, they would find Maria and Timothy inside. If they were unlucky, this could turn into a dangerous standoff. "Let's do it," Evans said, her voice resolute. "Get the team ready." The door to the apartment was forced open with a swift motion, the officers moving in with practiced efficiency. Evans' heart pounded as she followed them inside. The apartment was dark, with only the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the room. The furniture was sparse, and the walls were covered with old peeling paint. There was a smell of stale cigarettes and the faint scent of something stronger, something more intoxicating. At first, Evans saw nothing but shadows. Then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, the rustle of movement from behind the corner. "Police! Stay where you are!" Evans shouted. A figure stepped into the light, and Evans' breath caught in her throat. It was Timothy. The boy looked out of place, standing in the middle of the room with wide, panicked eyes. He was clutching something, a small silver knife, his hands trembling. "Timothy! Put it down!" Evans ordered, her voice softer now, attempting to keep him calm. The boy's eyes darted around the room, as though looking for an escape. "I didn't want to do it," he whispered. "Mom said... she said it had to happen." Evans's heart broke. This wasn't a child who had wanted to kill. This was a child who had been twisted, manipulated by the one person he trusted more than anyone, his mother. But there was no time to dwell on that now. "Timothy, listen to me," Evans said, stepping closer, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. You don't have to do this. It's over. Your mom isn't going to hurt anyone anymore. The boy looked at her, confusion and fear flooding his face. I didn't mean to. I thought it would make her happy. Evans took another step forward, closer now. It's okay, Timothy. We're going to help you. For a moment, the world seemed to stop as Evans moved slowly toward him. Timothy's shoulders shook with fear, and his grip on the knife loosened. With a final gentle command, she reached forward and carefully took the knife from his hands. Outside, the air felt colder. The confrontation was over, and the nightmare that had taken root in the Perez household was finally coming to an end. But Evans knew one truth was undeniable. The damage had already been done. There was no taking back the lives that had been lost, no undoing the pain that had been caused, and somewhere deep in the heart of Maria Perez, there was a darkness that would never be erased. Now it was time to bring her to justice. The rain had started falling in slow, heavy sheets as Evans sat alone in her office, sifting through the papers spread out before her. The case had taken a turn. Timothy Mitchell was safe for now. He'd been taken into protective custody, and the team had already begun the process of preparing his testimony. But Maria Perez remained the linchpin, and Evans knew that without her cooperation, the story wouldn't be complete. And without her being caught, the justice Rob and Jenna deserved would never be fully served. The truth about Maria was darker than anyone had realized. She wasn't just a woman scorned by an ex-husband. She was a manipulator, a person who would stop at nothing to satisfy her own desires. She had convinced her own son to participate in a murder because of her warped sense of entitlement and revenge. Yet despite everything, there was still something Evans couldn't put her finger on. What had been the driving force behind Maria's need to control her son? What had triggered her to take it this far? Evans looked at the clock on her desk. It was well past 9 p.m. The steady rhythm of the rain tapping against the windows was the only sound that filled the otherwise quiet room. She had just gotten off the phone with Reed. The team was preparing to move in on Maria Perez's last known location. They had tracked her to a nearby motel on the outskirts of town. The place wasn't much, a low-rent, nondescript building tucked away off the main road. Evans wasn't sure what to expect, but she had a feeling that Maria wasn't going to make it easy. The air was thick with tension as Evans and Reed drove to the motel. It wasn't far from the apartment where Timothy had been found, but it felt like a different world entirely. Isolated, almost forgotten. Evans's mind kept racing through the details of the case. Every conversation with witnesses, every clue leading her to this final confrontation. I don't think Maria's going to come quietly, Reed said as he glanced at Evans, who was staring. Out of the passenger side window, her eyes narrowed in concentration. No, Evans replied, her voice steady. She's been running for too long. She's cornered now. She knows it. As they pulled into the gravel parking lot, Evans's hand instinctively gripped the door handle, her knuckles white. They parked a few spaces away from the entrance, and Reed immediately signaled to the officers stationed nearby. Evans gave a firm nod, her mind locked on the task ahead. This ends tonight. They got out of the car and Evans walked toward the building, her boots tapping quietly on the wet pavement. There were only a few lights on in the motel, most of the rooms dark and seemingly unoccupied. The parking lot was eerily empty, save for the occasional car. Evans's gut told her Maria was still inside, that she hadn't left, and she wasn't about to let anyone stop her now. Inside, a few officers were already gathered around a small table, maps and diagrams of the motel spread before them. Evans approached, scanning the information quickly. She's in room 14, one of the officers, a young man named Tom, said, his face drawn. We've got eyes on the door, but she hasn't moved. No one's come in or out for the last hour. Evans nodded. Okay, good. Let's not waste any more time. We're going in. The team moved swiftly, surrounding the motel room with practiced precision. Evans' heart pounded as she took her place by the door, her hand on the handle. Reed was standing by the window, keeping a lookout for any movement, while two other officers covered the rear entrance. Evans glanced at the others briefly before giving the silent command. She didn't wait for confirmation. In one fluid motion, she forced the door open, the officers flooding in behind her. Maria Perez was sitting at the small table in the center of the room, her back to the door. She didn't look surprised, nor did she look scared. In fact, she looked calm, too calm. Evans's gaze quickly took in the room. It was sparse, a single bed against the far wall, an old wooden dresser, a lamp on the table. A few suitcases were scattered across the floor, suggesting she had been preparing to leave, but she hadn't gotten very far. Maria Perez, Evans said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. You're under arrest for the murder of Robert Mitchell and Jenna Hayes. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Maria didn't flinch, didn't even move. She simply stared at Evans, her cold eyes reflecting nothing but disdain. You're too late, Maria said softly, almost in a whisper, her voice devoid of emotion. You think you've won? You think you've uncovered the truth? It's too late for your precious justice. It's already done. Evans's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. What are you talking about, Maria? Maria's lips curled into a faint, almost bitter smile. I was never going to let them go. They, Rob and Jenna, they deserved to pay for what they did to me, to my son. I gave him everything. I raised him alone, made him strong, and they just took him from me. You don't understand. He was all I had left, and they were going to destroy him. So I had to act first. Her words hit Evans like a slap in the face. It wasn't just about revenge on Rob and Jenna. It was about something far darker. Maria had convinced herself she was protecting her son, but in doing so, she had damaged him irreparably, turning him into a tool of destruction. Evans realized in that moment that Maria didn't see herself as a villain. She saw herself as a protector, a mother trying to reclaim control over everything that had been taken from her. You used your son, Evans said, her voice steady but full of contempt. You manipulated him into murder, Maria, and now you're going to pay for it. Maria laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. I don't care. I'll never care. They've all betrayed me. You, your little badge, your precious system. It all means nothing. You can't save him. It's over. The game's already been played, and I won. Evans's hand tightened around the gun at her side. There was no remorse in Maria's words, no sense of guilt. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was only angry that it hadn't worked out as she'd planned. But Evans wouldn't let her win. Not now. Not ever. You're wrong, Maria, Evans said, her voice hard. The game's not over yet. You're going to stand trial for what you've done. And this time, you're not getting away. Maria stood up slowly, her face now contorted with rage. You don't get it. You never will. It was always about control. And now? Now it's too late. Before Evans could react, Maria's hand shot toward a bag on the table. In a split second, a loud bang echoed through the room as Maria pulled out a gun, a small, sleek handgun, and aimed it directly at Evans. The officers around her tensed, but Evans acted first. In a single, decisive motion, Evans drew her own weapon, firing once. The shot rang out, a sharp, precise sound that shattered the tension in the room. Maria's gun dropped to the floor with a clatter, her body collapsing backward onto the bed. Evans rushed forward, securing the weapon, making sure there was no further threat. Maria was still breathing, but her movement had slowed to a crawl. Blood pooled beneath her, a dark stain spreading quickly. Evans felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. This was the end of the line for Maria Perez. Her reign of terror had come to a bloody conclusion. Hours later, Evans stood at the edge of the crime scene, watching as the lights from the police cars lit up the darkened parking lot. Maria Perez was dead, but the truth was finally out. Timothy was safe, though he would need time to heal from the years of manipulation and abuse he had endured. And in the end, Rob and Jenna would finally receive the justice they deserved. But Evans knew one thing. Justice was rarely as clean as it seemed. There would always be scars on the victims, on the families, and on those who had to pick up the pieces. As she watched the rain continue to pour, Evans couldn't help but feel the weight of the case pressing on her shoulders. It wasn't over. It never really was. But for now, at least, the truth had prevailed. It had been days since the death of Maria Perez, and the storm that had ripped through her life seemed to have calmed, though its aftershocks still lingered. Detective Laura Evans sat at her desk, a fresh cup of coffee in front of her, her mind still buzzing with the aftermath of the case. The press had moved on, and the headlines had shifted to the next big story. But for Evans, the weight of the tragedy didn't leave. It never did, not after a case like this. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling the dull ache of exhaustion deep in her bones. She had done her job. The killer was dead. Timothy was safe. The case was closed, or at least as closed as it could be. But there were questions that still plagued her. Was there anything she could have done differently? Could she have prevented Maria's manipulation of Timothy? Was it possible to have stopped Rob and Jenna's murder before it happened? The answers to those questions would never come, and that was the hardest part. There were no real victories in this line of work, just moments of clarity, fleeting truths, and the knowledge that justice, while imperfect, had been served. But there was no way to undo the damage, no way to fix the broken pieces. Evans's phone buzzed on her desk, interrupting her thoughts. She picked it up without looking, pressing the receiver to her ear. "Evans," she said, her voice tired but professional. "Detective," a voice on the other end greeted. "This is Officer Reed. I just wanted to let you know we're making arrangements for Timothy. Social Services is taking him to a new foster home. He's been through hell, but they're giving him the best care they can. He's going to need a lot of therapy, but we're hopeful." Evans felt a small sense of relief. At least Timothy had a chance to rebuild. At least he wouldn't be left to spiral further into the darkness Maria had created for him. But she also knew it would take a long time for him to find peace, if he ever could. "Thanks, Reed," Evans replied. "Keep me updated on his progress." "I will, Detective," Reed said. "And hey, I know it's been tough, but we all know you did the right thing. Maria wasn't going to stop. You saved that boy from becoming a killer, too." Evans sighed and smiled faintly, though the words didn't bring her the comfort they once might have. "I just wish I could have saved Rob and Jenna from what happened." Reed's voice softened. "I know, but you did what you could." The line went silent for a moment, and Evans could almost feel Reed's sympathy through the phone. "I'll talk to you later, Reed," Evans said, ending the call. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting out the window as the sun dipped behind the skyline. The rain from the night before had stopped, but the remnants of the storm still hung in the air. The following days passed in a blur. Evans worked through the paperwork, wrapped up the final details of the case, and gave her report to the higher-ups. Maria Perez's death had raised eyebrows, and some questioned whether Evans had acted too quickly, but the evidence was clear. Maria had been a threat. Her attempt to kill Evans was an immediate risk, and Evans had acted in self-defense. There was no room for doubt in the investigation. Still, the consequences of that night weighed on Evans, even as she tried to convince herself that it had been the only way. The media predictably latched onto the story, painting Maria as a tragic figure, a mother driven to madness by years of neglect and betrayal. Some of the stories even sympathized with her motives, presenting her as a victim of a broken system. It made Evans sick. There was no sympathy for the real victims in this case: Rob, Jenna, and Timothy. Evans found herself on the receiving end of both praise and criticism. The praise came from her colleagues who recognized her dedication to solving the case. The criticism came from outside, from those who either didn't understand or didn't care about the truth. But Evans had grown used to that. What mattered was the truth, even when it was ugly. Even when it was impossible to make it fit into a neat narrative. She walked into the small cafe across the street from the police station, a familiar place she often went to clear her head. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air. She took a seat in the corner, staring out the window at the bustling street outside. For a moment, she let herself be lost in the mundane. The hum of the city, the chatter of customers, the sound of a cup being set down on the table next to her. "Detective Evans," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a familiar face, a woman in her late 30s, with warm eyes and a kind smile. It was Maggie Hayes, Jenna's mother. Evans froze for a moment. She hadn't seen Maggie since the day of the funeral, when she'd spoken briefly to the grieving mother. Maggie had been understandably devastated by the loss of her daughter. Now standing before her, her face was weary but determined. Detective, do you mind if I join you? Maggie asked quietly. Evans gave a soft smile and gestured to the empty seat. Of course. Please. Maggie sat down, her hands folded on the table. She looked at Evans, her expression neutral but with a sadness that had become a permanent part of her face. There was no bitterness in her eyes, just a quiet sorrow. I know it's been a while, Maggie said after a moment of silence. I just wanted to thank you for what you did, for catching the people responsible. Evans nodded, her throat tightening. I did my job, Maggie. You don't have to thank me. Maggie shook her head. I know, but still, I've been thinking about something. You probably think I'm crazy for this, but it's something I need to say. Evans raised an eyebrow but remained silent, giving her the space to speak. I've been so angry at Maria for what she did to Jenna, to Rob, to Timothy, and I'm still angry. I'll never stop being angry. Maggie's voice cracked slightly, but she took a deep breath, steadying herself. But after everything you've told me, I've started to realize something. Maria wasn't just a monster. She was a broken person. She was manipulative, yes, but she was also a victim of her own wounds. The way she treated her son, the way she couldn't let go of Rob. It wasn't just about power. It was about fear. Fear of losing control. Evans listened, a mix of guilt and understanding tugging at her. She had always believed that once someone crossed the line into violence, they were no longer worthy of sympathy. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Maria had never seen herself as a villain. She had seen herself as a protector, even if her protection had been nothing more than a twisted form of control. I don't think you're crazy, Maggie, Evans said softly. I think you're right. Maria was broken, but it doesn't excuse what she did. What matters now is that Timothy has a chance to rebuild his life, and Rob and Jenna, they'll always be remembered. Maggie's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. Yes, I've been trying to hold on to that, but it's hard, you know. I miss her. I miss my daughter. I always will. I understand, Evans said, her voice thick with empathy. I truly do. They sat in silence for a while, the clinking of cups and low murmurs of other patrons filling the space between them. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a recognition that the world wasn't always as black and white as they'd like to think. People were complicated. Maria, Rob, Jenna, Timothy. Each of them had their own story. Some stories ended with redemption, others ended in tragedy, but there was always a price to pay for the truth. As Evans left the cafe, she stepped out into the cool evening air. The sky had cleared, and the stars above shone bright against the dark canvas of the night. She felt a heavy weight lift from her shoulders, the kind of weight that came with knowing the case was truly over. She didn't have all the answers, but she had done what she could. The city was still there, the world still turning. But for Evans, the journey was far from over. She had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also witnessed the possibility of healing, and in that she found some small measure of peace. The truth had cost her, just as it had cost everyone involved. But in the end, it was the only thing worth fighting for. As Evans walked back toward her car, she looked up at the sky one last time and whispered a quiet promise. She would keep fighting for the victims,